Good afternoon, dear participants of World Investor Week 2021, and welcome to the session Frontier of Finance Beyond Climate, kindly organized today by our speakers. My name is Eleonora Kusimbayeva, and I'm head of the University of the Future in Bureau of Continuous Professional Development, and I will moderate this session today for you. Before we start, I kindly ask all participants to learn the rules of this session. The duration of this session is 1 hour, including 10 to 15 minutes for question and answers. The session is being translated to Russian. To enable it, in your Zoom control, click Interpretation and click the language that you would like to hear. To hear the interpreted language only, click Mute Original Audio. For questions to the speakers, there is a Q&A session that's being organized after we will conduct all the presentation speeches today. So please use the chat box or Q&A section and address all your questions. You can do this within the whole session, and we will answer all the questions after we finish all the presentation. So let me highlight once again this year the central theme of World Investor Week in AFC, which is the main objectives of which is informing about investment opportunities and tools, raising awareness about consumer protection and investment risk, facilities of financial education and financial literacy, discussion of innovation and financial markets. So let's begin our session, and I would like to present the first speaker, Mr. George Littlejohn. George is qualified a chartered accountant with PwC in London before becoming a journalist with The Economist, specializing in financial and economic matters. He is now a senior advisor at the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment, the global professional body, having conducted advisory work amongst investment management firms across Europe, the Middle East, Asia over the past 2 decades. He is a graduate of the University of Edinburgh with a Master in Development Economics, and he is the author of a number of works on risk management in finance. Thank you for your attention. Let's proceed with our session, and George, the floor is yours.
Eleonora, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thanks so much to you and your colleagues for inviting us to this wonderful week of events. I'm very sorry that we can't be in Nur Sultan with you, but that will come to pass maybe next year. As Eleonora said, I'm from the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment. Some of you watching, I know in Kazakhstan, have done our exams, are members indeed. We're a professional body with some 50,000 members worldwide, mainly across Eurasia, Middle East, Africa, Australia. We were until 30 years ago part of London Stock Exchange, and when they became themselves a listed business rather than a cooperative, they set us up as an independent body, a charity with a royal charter. And we do what all professional bodies do, which is help educate and keep people in the business up to date. Now, we've done, as you can imagine, a lot of work for our members in the climate space. Indeed, just last night, we were told that we had been shortlisted by the Financial Times for an award for innovation in an exam we have just launched with our friends at the Chartered Banker Institute on climate risk. This was quite hard work to put together, not least because the issues involving climate risk change not every month or every week, but every day. The issue becomes more and more important, more and more complicated. And we're now about a month from COP26. Indeed, it starts 3 weeks on Sunday in my native Glasgow. COP26, I'm sure everyone knows, is the much awaited UN summit on climate change. Now, recently, we did a big event for our members 2 days after the United Nations group of eminent scientists formally declared that human beings were responsible for climate change. You may think we've known that for many years. Well, we think we have, but this was the first time this group of 100 very senior scientists had agreed that it was definitely the human beings' problem and fault, and we were therefore due to do something about it. So we've covered a lot of issues around climate change and related sustainable development goals, including areas like health, education, agriculture, and so on. These are almost as important for many of our investor members as climate change. But there's one key area where we were very lucky to find that Derek and Peter, to whom I'll introduce you in a moment, have done some really great work, which is on geopolitical risk affecting ESG, investment, environmental, social governance in general, climate change in particular. And I'm not going to waste any more of your time by telling you about CISI or what we've been doing. I'm going to start right away by introducing you to Derek. Derek Leatherdale, who will speak first, is founder of GRI Strategies and an associate director of the Risk Coalition, of which Peter, whom Derek will introduce in a moment, was one of the founders. And Derek and Peter will explain what this great body, the Risk Coalition, does. Derek was HSBC's founding global head of geopolitical risk, and he set up the bank's group geopolitical risk function before leading the bank's global government affairs campaigns. Derek also has prior experience in national security and intelligence roles for the British government, although obviously he can't talk about that in public. GRI works with firms across industry sectors to improve oversight and management of geopolitical risks. And Derek is the co-author with Peter and a number of their Risk Coalition colleagues of a publication called the Extra G, ESG Squared, which is new guidance on the oversight and management of geopolitical and related ESG risks for company boards and risk functions. Derek and Peter, over to you, and thank you very much for doing this today.
George, many thanks for such a sort of comprehensive and flattering introduction. I'm sure I don't deserve it, but good afternoon, everyone else listening. Let me just share my slide deck for this presentation so that we can get going and into the session. I hope everyone can see the first slide, but please do let someone know if you can't. But just to reiterate what George said, my name is Derek Leatherdale. I run GRI Strategies here in the UK, but work with firms globally. And my co-presenter today is Peter Neville-Lewis, one of the founding members of the Risk Coalition, whom George just mentioned. I won't sort of add too much to what George said in his very flattering remarks about me, beyond saying that just to reiterate, I set up HSBC's group geopolitical risk function about a dozen years ago now, or just over a dozen years ago. And in the course of that work and in the course of embedding the function's work into the wider firm, I worked with all the lines of business in HSBC, but particularly the investment bank, and within that, the asset management business, as well as the markets business, and indeed the trade finance and the corporate banking businesses as well, in addition to a range of other support functions. And as George mentioned, I am the co-author of the guidance that we will touch on in the course of this presentation, and which is imminently about to be released. Let me just hand over to Peter briefly to introduce the Risk Coalition a little bit more, and also to introduce himself a little bit more.
Hello, everybody, and welcome delegates to this interesting session. A bit about the Risk Coalition and myself. You know that I'm one of the founders. We actually started this journey back in 2017, and there are a team of 5 of us. Derek is one, the core lead team, I should say, and various associates who work alongside us. And we have an advisory board of 8 very senior risk professionals, including a former director of the Bank of England. We are a loose association, as you can see from the logos on screen, of not-for-profit bodies, professional bodies, trade bodies, academics, regulators, and other interested parties. We published our first piece of guidance under the auspices of the FRC in London, and with the support of the FCA, our regulatory body for financial services, which was called Raising the Bar in 2019, right at the end, December. And as Derek said, we are just about to publish a follow-on version to this called the Extra G, with its focus very much on risk oversight in the geopolitical and associated ESG risk area. We are also active in the sustainability world. We run the Chief Risk Officers Sustainability Forum in London, and Derek himself is also very soon going to be launching a 5-module program with a leading institution in the States, and in conjunction one of the major universities there, on geopolitical risk. And if we have your details, we'll certainly be circulating this, and it will be on all our promotional activities on our LinkedIn website in a few weeks' time. The aim of the Risk Coalition is to provide leading practice guidance for boards, risk committees, risk functions, and any executives with risk responsibility. And to reinforce these principles, we have our own online unique assessment tool called GABI, G-A-B-I, and I will talk about that a little later. But for now, that's enough about me and the Risk Coalition. So Derek, back to you, please.
Thanks very much indeed, Peter, and let me move on. So just to give you a sense of what we will cover in about the next 20 minutes or so, I want to cover sort of 4 main areas. The first is to look at in very brief terms, look at the global geopolitical environment and some of the impacts that volatility is having on the business and investment environment. I then want to explore how that links to investment management in general, but also how it complicates ESG decision making. I then want to have a look at how that can impact portfolio and investment management decisions in particular. And then in the final section of the presentation, start touching on the response, the things that you as financial professionals can start thinking about doing in response to geopolitical uncertainty and volatility. So first up, what's going on globally that's causing the problem? This is a subject that is very wide-ranging and for which I could spend several days talking, but we don't have the time to do that here. I just wanted to highlight just a few key geopolitical issues that are coming to dominate the global political landscape. The first of those is, of course, US-China and increasing friction in the US-China relationship, revolving around a number of issues: geographic and sovereignty competitions, but also policy disputes around issues like trade, around issues like technology, around the use of measures like sanctions, and a number of other areas of friction too. Second, there is, as ever, ongoing the potential for ongoing political instability in the Middle East. That's not really new, but the political picture in the Middle East has certainly evolved in recent years and still generates considerable potential for political instability. Thirdly, I would just highlight that in a way that perhaps wasn't deemed to be the case 15 or 20 years ago, political instability is now a feature of developed markets as well as emerging markets. And so, for instance, issues in relation to political and fiscal stability in the Eurozone, Brexit, of course, and also concern, particularly amongst the investment community, about political issues in the United States. This time last year, I think many in the investment world were concerned about the prospects of a contested presidential transition in the US. Fast forward to where we are now, and there are once again concerns, particularly amongst the investment community, over whether Congress will approve an increase to the debt ceiling, raising the prospect once again of a US debt default. And then, of course, there are a host of political issues elsewhere in the world, some in emerging markets across Southeast Asia, parts of Africa and parts of Latin America. And all of those, to a greater or lesser extent, I think are likely to be exacerbated by the pandemic and some of the political and fiscal consequences of the public policy responses to the coronavirus pandemic. Now, that's sort of a very brief overview, but I just thought it worth sharing a perspective on how your peers in the global financial sector view the global geopolitical and risk environment. The graphic you can see in front of you is drawn from a survey run by the Institute of International Finance. The data for this survey was collected just before the onset of the pandemic, so has been somewhat sort of updated since then. All these perspectives will have evolved since then. But what you will see on the graphic in front of you is a concern, particularly amongst global chief risk officers, about the direction of travel in the global geopolitical environment. And then in the column with the different size circles, those circles represent the number of survey respondents who indicated that the issues in each circle were of concern to them and their organizations. That will give you a sense of some of the issues that were, as it were, top of mind for global chief risk officers at this stage in late 2019. I think it's fair to say that the onset of COVID and the various political issues that will fall out of that will have added to concern around some of those circles. So clearly, for instance, concern or concern about relations with China have increased in some other countries, notably the US, and of course Australia as well. There has been some political fallout there. But equally, that some of the other issues highlighted in this graphic will also have gained in importance and salience for the global financial community as a result of the impacts of COVID. On the right-hand side of the graphic, there are also some indications of where chief risk officers think that these issues will, as it were, have most impact in respect of market dynamics. For instance, in exacerbated levels of unexpected market volatility. So what impacts can geopolitical uncertainty have for those in the financial community and indeed the investment management community in particular? I've broken the impacts down into three main areas. Those direct impacts where policy measures by governments are particularly focused either on industry sectors, which are the subject of investment, or capital or financial or other investment flows that are relevant to the investment management community. And you can see this particularly, for instance, in the US, where measures have been introduced to make it more, they would say, to enhance the scrutiny of Chinese firms wishing to list on US stock markets, but a range of other measures too around sanctions and other investment controls and investment flows. Then there are a series of indirect impacts that that global political volatility can have. And I list some of those on the right-hand side of the slide in front of you, but particularly those impacts can affect the macroeconomic environment and the trade and financial flows that characterize the global economic environment. And that can track through to the performance of individual firms or industry sectors. And a very good example of that, the International Monetary Fund produced some interesting analysis showing that for US firms with high levels of export dependence on China saw their share prices decline as a result of the imposition of US tariffs 2.5-3 years ago. Global political volatility can, of course, also generate the kind of unexpected events that also generate or flow into volatility in key asset classes and key market segments. And then finally, just to touch on the ESG dimensions of this, climate risk can clearly drive geopolitical risk. So for instance, climate change is likely to drive the kind of destabilizing migration flows that can exacerbate political uncertainty and political instability. But equally, geopolitics can drive ESG and climate risk. So the causal link works the other way around. So for instance, multilateral attempts to reduce carbon dioxide emissions have foundered in recent years because of a lack of cooperation at the international level between governments. And even now, it's not clear that frictions in the US-China relationship will be able to be overcome in respect of joint approaches to reducing carbon emissions. We also see as well, of course, the introduction of what the European Union call carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and they are being seen by some others as a form of additional tariff or protectionism in a way that is likely to exacerbate geoeconomic and geopolitical frictions. And all of that collectively can complicate the ESG environment. And to give you one very good example of potentially very many, as the world's vehicle fleets progressively electrify, they will need batteries that draw on a number of precious metals, not the least of which is lithium. And lithium is the subject of an already intense and increasing competition, for instance, between the US and China. And so the idea that this is a straightforward ESG dynamic doesn't really hold, that there are political and geopolitical complexities to the manner in which that lithium is acquired for use in electric vehicle fleets. So that's a sort of broad overview of the landscape. But the next question really from a financial sector and investment management point of view is, what can you do about all of this? And that's really where we want to focus on for the next part of the presentation. Broadly, there are three levels of response in the investment management community. The first is what we have described as the tactical response, looking at individual portfolio decisions and trying to understand how a single geopolitical issue or a single political issue will affect individual components of individual portfolios. And you can use a range of specialist impact analysis and risk management tools to facilitate and help that process. And that can ultimately lead to steps, for instance, to diversify portfolios so that risk is either spread or sort of balanced off in a portfolio in a way that perhaps wouldn't otherwise have been. There is also, of course, the option of hedging, where if part of your portfolio is in, for instance, commodity markets, that you can buy forward to mitigate against the prospect of price rises in the future. Those are some of the sort of more common steps. But what we don't see is that this is done in a uniform or systematic basis. And that's something that we'll touch on shortly. I would just add as well, from an investment management point of view, geopolitical volatility is not necessarily all downside risk, that there are some opportunities out there. So, for instance, in the UK, a couple of weeks ago, a number of the UK's gas supply firms have started to cease trading. And in response to that, their customer, and sorry, this is driven heavily by the steep rise in wholesale gas prices in Europe. As a result of that, some of the remaining gas companies in the UK have picked up extra customers and have seen their share prices rise. And that's a good example of where geopolitical issues can feed through to market dynamics and create market opportunity as well as downside risk. Now, I just thought on that point about systematic integration, the graphic in front of you now it draws on the same survey that I referenced a few minutes ago, but it looks at the way financial institutions feel that they are able to adapt to increasing levels of volatility and velocity in the geopolitical environment, and also some of the ways that they are starting to integrate geopolitical factors into their decision making. And that's really the left-hand side and the central elements of this graphic. On the right-hand side, you'll see how second-line risk functions are starting to incorporate these issues into their approaches, their frameworks, and their agendas. But I think the point, and you will be able to see the slide deck after we have finished this presentation, I think the point to make in respect of this graphic is that there is considerable variation amongst financial institutions about how they are seeking to integrate these issues into the various aspects of strategy, planning, and risk management that they undertake. And that this really highlights, in a sense, that approaches amongst the financial sector are not yet systematic and holistic. So what's the answer to that? And this is where I think we get to a higher level of response for firms in the financial sector. You need really to integrate geopolitical factors and considerations into the broader approach and broader framework of risk governance and risk management to make sure that a response by an organization to this environment is coherent, systematic. It covers all the relevant parts of the organization and can enable firms to take opportunities where they exist with more confidence. And really, we break that down into a number of areas. There's quite a bit of detail which sits below the bullets in this slide. You will be able to read these, though, after the presentation. But broadly, the key elements of a framework to deal with this kind of environment involve higher levels of board awareness and much more routine integration of these issues and their impacts on the business and consideration of their impacts on the business in routine governance approaches, and effective integration and coherent integration into a framework also relies on having enhanced internal capabilities to drive the impact and impact analysis and associated consideration of mitigation to these issues where they affect your organization. Now, of course, that has to be done proportionately. And for a large firm like HSBC, there was resource to be able to bring some of that capability in-house. And for smaller firms, this will inevitably, I think, rely on some external support as well. But leveraging that external support in a considered and systematic way is really key, rather than just drawing on it at individual moments to support individual decisions. There is, I think, an added layer for the investment management community on this. As I say in this slide, or as we say in this slide, if you are investing in other companies, those other companies themselves may well be exposed to geopolitical risk. And in a sense, their exposures to geopolitical and geoeconomic risk are your exposures, because ultimately their performance will track through to value in your portfolio. And in that sense, it's important to understand how they may be exposed, and even more importantly, to understand how they are approaching managing their exposures. And I think it's fair to say, as a general rule, that as a corporate discipline, if you like, geopolitical risk management is not very mature amongst many firms, that this is still something that companies don't do very well. They struggle with for a number of reasons. And really, therefore, the question from an investment management point of view is, how can you know if the companies in which you are investing are handling these issues well? And at that point, with that question in mind, I will hand over to Peter to talk more about the guidance that we have that can help you in that process.
Thank you, Derek. That's an excellent overview. Right, so very briefly, we have, as I mentioned earlier, an online tool which allows organizations to assess against the principles that we have set out in the Extra G. There are, in fact, 54 different principles divided roughly half and half between those required by a board and the board risk committee or executive risk committee or risk oversight committee. This will vary in organizations as to how this is approached. And also the executive function, which is the risk function, then the head of risk or chief risk officer. Again, titles will vary. But this tool, GABI, the GABI stands for Gap Analysis and Benchmarking Insights. The tool enables you to assess yourself against the principles we've set out in considerable detail. It allows for comment, free text, and there are a number of suggestions which we give as to how you could improve against some of these principles if you feel, as was indicated in one of the earlier slides, that approaches to geopolitical and ESG risk are perhaps in need of some improvement, certainly in certain areas. Next slide, please, Derek. As I mentioned, there are two sections to our GABI assessment tool. The first is on the left, the series of green discs, the board and board risk committee principles. They're probably not very easy to read, but it's just an indication that there are a series of them, and they all focus around board accountability for geopolitical and related risks. And then the blue circles relate to the requirements which we see, the principles which would hold firm and good for a risk function and the risk officers overseeing that part of the business. Next slide, please, Derek. So what does GABI do? It is unique. There isn't another tool like this on the marketplace. There are a wide range of questions. The survey will take probably 45 minutes to an hour to complete. It's not a quick, easy yes/no binary questionnaire. It does require some preparation and some application when you complete it. Its value derives very much from the fact that we allow as many as 12 people in for the subscription, for each subscription, to provide feedback. You can have more than 12 if you want to, but the basic subscription fee allows 12 users. So you can seek views from the first line, second line, third line, other parts of the business, non-execs, even the board, CFO, whatever. So you've got a rounded view. And because there are the opportunity to provide free text responses and a number of suggestions relative to improving performance, you do receive in the final report, all of which aggregates the individual feedback from people doing the survey, a very comprehensive view. And it's a view, if you like, from the business, from the front line. It is not a consultant's view. This is what real people in your business are telling you needs to be done better, improved, etc. And it also highlights those themes. So if you've got maybe as many as 15 we often have that many, 15 to 20 respondents, if the majority of them, if 75 or 80% are all saying, we need to do better at this, we could do more of that, there you have straight away some thematic analysis, some clues as to where you need to focus your efforts. The tool is also valid from subscription for 12 months, which means you can go back in that period and review any areas where you were not entirely comfortable with the initial responses. So you can see if you've taken some mitigating steps, whether that has had the desired effect and whether the feedback is improving. And finally, we will be collecting anonymized data from all of this. And in due course, we will have some very valuable benchmarking against industry sectors and against peers in your industry. This is going to take a little time to build up. We did, in fact, launch with our initial risk oversight guidance, which I mentioned earlier, raising the bar, a similar tool called GABI Prime, and we already have data from that. And as the guidance is largely principles based, there's quite a lot of crossover between the two versions of our tool. So the benchmarking, I think we will have something beginning to be quite meaningful, certainly by Q1, Q2 next year. Next slide, please, Derek. So that really is enough from me. I think that gives you a quick oversight of what we can do. And it is important that if you are concerned about how you are addressing these issues and all the indications that we have had, surveys we've seen from the major consulting firms, Derek referenced the International Financial Institute, they all show that less than 50% of people are really comfortable, and these are executives, people in senior positions, finance, etc., that they are less than comfortable with or satisfied with their oversight of geopolitical and ESG related issues. It is a big thing. We know that. I don't need you to tell you that it's top of the agenda for most boards right now. So we hope that we can help you. We've got some valuable survey material which we can share with you, and of course Derek's expertise and some of my colleagues can help with ongoing consulting. So I think let's turn this over now to some questions from the floor, please. And do get in touch with us, by the way. We will circulate these, as Derek said, these slides. There are various ways you can get in touch with us directly. We have a Risk Coalition LinkedIn page. Derek has his own page, GRI Strategies, all of which will provide you with valuable background. So Eleonora, please.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Derek. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get the questions from the participants because we've been broadcasted live on YouTube channel. So we need to proceed with the session, or if the session is over, then I think we are already in time.
I'm just wondering whether George might like to give us a couple of two or three sort of headline questions just to broaden the debate wider, and Derek and I will respond. I see we've got approximately 15 minutes left, so let's make good use certainly of the next 10 minutes.
Thank you, Peter.
And Eleonora, thank you, and thank you, Peter and Derek, for a fascinating presentation. There's one important issue in the world just now, but also in Kazakhstan in particular, which is that of corporate governance, of which you've touched all the way through here. And it'd be very interesting on which Kazakhstan has been planning, particularly at the Astana International Financial Center, an appropriate and scalable new governance system which suits the nature of business and governance in the country, and also in AIFC, which, as you know, is a slightly separate entity, or a very separate entity. But how would you recommend that boards should proceed in terms of structuring themselves to make sure that they can cope with these risks that we've been talking about? Do you need a geopolitical risk expert sitting on the board, or is this a skill that should be embedded in a number of colleagues? How would you recommend companies in Eurasia in general, Kazakhstan in particular, should think about this from a board perspective?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I was. If you're happy, Peter, I'll lead on this. George, I think part of the answer to this is that it depends on the company, its size, its location, its business model, its exposures, and there are some firms where it would be appropriate to bring in into the board expertise on an in-house basis. I think as a general rule, though, the prior step is to make sure that boards are integrating these issues into their deliberations, out of which it can become clear whether they have sufficient expertise available to them to be able to inform their discussions and deliberations. Now, some of the impact analysis and some of the mitigation strategies that can flow from that may well be generated or should be generated by executive management. The risk function can play a role in, if you like, providing the expertise to inform that, the geopolitical analytical expertise to inform that process. In a sense, the risk function could be if you like, an internal center of excellence on these issues. But throughout that, whichever element of the business or the board is looking at these issues, having the expertise to be able to judge them is clearly key. And that's, I think, an area where boards and other areas of companies generally don't have a kind of systematic approach. The other point that we bring out in the guidance, George, is that the board will often devolve oversight of risk management to one of its committees, and it may be actually more appropriate that the committee in question, which in financial services, certainly in the UK, is often called a board risk committee, but in other industry sectors it can be sort of contained in other board committees, for instance, the audit committee. But whichever committee it is, make sure that they have the skill sets that they need to be able to judge geopolitical issues and to be able to challenge, where necessary, management decision making, where geopolitical issues and related ESG issues are a factor. And just to tease out on that point, one sort of quick codicil, one quick extra point. I was speaking to a fund manager here in London last week who said very often in the investment management world, heads of ESG and or sustainability issues in firms very often come at ESG from a very sort of climate centric perspective. They often don't have a background in or a focus on the S or the G of ESG. And therein, they often then end up missing the politics or the geopolitics in this agenda. And from a board and governance point of view, being able to drive, if you like, integrated or coherent oversight and challenge where there is not sufficient connectivity between, say, a head of sustainability and a head of risk is really key. And having the skill sets at board level or board committee level to be able to do that is key. Second order question, do you need those skill sets, full-time board member to do that, or do you need to acquire some external input to inform discussions? Both are eminently feasible. And we wouldn't judge one way or the other which is preferable. It really depends on the individual firm.
I would just add to that as well that you mentioned the word independent, Derek, and I think, and I'm sure George would agree, it's no good having a dedicated committee, even if it's a standalone risk committee, or even if it's part of another committee, like as it very often is, audit and risk. If it has no proper independence. There must be independence. A risk function and a risk committee has to be able to challenge the board and be respected for that. And that unfortunately is not always the case because boards don't necessarily appoint people to carry out these functions with sufficient seniority and status for them to carry weight and influence in the decisions that they are proposing within an organization. So I think that would apply anywhere, not just Eurasia, that independence of risk advice is critical, and an openness by the board to receive this in the way that it is meant. So that I would just like to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter and Derek. That was very interesting indeed. Can I just turn now, if there is time, Eleanor, to another question, which is about the key difference between risk and uncertainty. In the financial world, we all love risk. It's how we make our money, by making decisions about risk and investing or lending or whatever accordingly, taking positions. Uncertainty we don't like because we're not sure what's going to happen, and that becomes very tricky. Now, a lot of the risks that we're talking about here could be portrayed as uncertainties. I mean, right now, for instance, I don't think any of us sitting around this webinar could say that at the beginning of last year, we could have predicted the impact of the pandemic. Some of us might have said there's something odd in Wuhan, but we couldn't have said the whole world is going to close down for quite a long time because of this. None of us, I don't think. Forgive me if anyone on the call believes that, but I'm not sure that's the case. But right now, for instance, 100 meters from me here in London, there'll be a line of cars waiting for petrol because we seem to have run out of petrol in Britain in the petrol stations. In China, biggest coal producer in the world, there's a shortage of coal coming this winter. In India, second biggest coal producer, there's a shortage of coal right now. People are getting cold in the northern parts of India and in western parts of China right now. So those are big geopolitical uncertainties about coal, which is a bad thing. We would all consider coal to be bad for the future of the planet, but people need it to power factories, to power railways, to heat their homes. How many of these geopolitical risks are actual risks? How many are geopolitical uncertainties? And how does that affect how boards in particular should address them?
Peter, if you don't mind, I'll jump in. This is a sort of subject particularly close to my heart. I think just by way of a quick word or two of context, no one really saw the financial crisis coming. And for the global financial sector, the response thereafter and the regulatory response was to, in general terms, sort of vastly upgrade the regulatory framework and requirements around risks and risk management that financial institutions themselves could control. And you might argue that by and large, that process has run through, and that risk management in the financial sector now is sort of substantially upgraded around those internal risks, if you like, the things that firms can control directly, how much money they lend in certain markets, or the way they taper their insurance portfolios, or the extent to which they diversify risk in investment portfolios in the investment management community. All of those things can be controlled by firms. Some of the risks that you mentioned, George, are clearly outside the direct control of firms. And I think geopolitics is obviously in that category. To the extent there is any lever that firms can pull, it might be lobbying individual governments. And, as a government affairs lead for HSBC after doing geopolitical risk work, I saw some of that, but it's at best, it's a very sort of patchy lever. And otherwise firms don't really have any control over the external environment. And it's not just geopolitics, but clearly pandemics. There's nothing firms can do to control pandemic risk at source. Likewise, climate, there's very little firms can do to control the direction of climate risk. And I think what I say all of that because I think we're now into an era in the financial community where risks, it's not that there aren't risks, if you like, internal risks within the business models of individual firms, but that by and large, the way those risks are now addressed is substantially upgraded. We've moved, I think, into an era where many of the risks we're talking about are outside the direct control of firms. And therefore, they do go into the category of being, if you like, hard to control because of the risk versus uncertainty dilemma. They're hard to measure. hard to put hard numbers on them. And, the old adage in risk management is that what you can't measure, you can't manage. And that sort of adds to the challenge and the complexity. I think out of that come two main things, and we get at this in the guidance. One is that one kind of corporate governance response to that challenge is to sort of ignore it, to say this is just too difficult to grapple with, so we won't do anything about it. But actually the point we get to in the guidance is to say it's precisely because it's hard to grapple with, you need more corporate governance, not less. It's exactly on these kinds of external risks that are hard to measure, hard to control, that you need a more active governance sort of approach. And there are ways of helping to reduce uncertainty, or at least to start understanding how, if a particular constellation of factors were to unfold, the kind of impacts it may have on your organization. And really there, I'm talking about things like scenario analysis in general terms, and other sort of similar forecasting methodologies. Where you track that into the financial sector, it can come particularly in banking, it can come into stress testing. And I think in investment management, it can be particularly useful in the equivalent, the liquidity adequacy assessment process. So you can start to use existing tools like that to start to understand how particular risk constellations can affect you. You can also sort of, as it were, use generic scenarios, generic sort of frameworks of events that may not be perfect predictions of the future, but nevertheless make sure or help you ensure that you are better prepared if something happens that generates downside risk. Sorry, that was a rather long-winded answer, but it's sort of, it's a very relevant question.
Not long-winded at all, very comprehensive. Peter.
I would just add to that. I agree with everything Derek has said, that we have moved, I think, in the last 5 years almost, from what I call quantifiable risk to not so easily quantifiable risk. And I use that word quantifiable because so much risk in the last decade or so has become quant managed, quant assessed. You can work everything out. There's a numerical answer to everything, and that's been driven particularly within financial services. But I just don't think that holds true. Most of the big risks now, geopolitical, ESG, governance, conduct, culture, all the things the regulators are talking about and are most concerned about are not easily quantifiable. And therefore, it is even more imperative, as Derek says, that you get the governance of risk right and you make sure you have the right people, because I don't think you're going to find quant solutions that easily to the geopolitical and ESG related issues. So there's a bit of a shift, I think, a mental attitude towards what risk, how do we govern, how do we manage, how do we oversee risk? It's become more nuanced. And boards need to recognize this and I think take appropriate steps.
Just to add to that, George, I think the point, and this is where I think the guidance helps, it actually lays out how boards can do that. What do boards need to do to actually start exercising more effective governance? So it's not just, if you like, an exhortation that they should do more. It offers something akin to a roadmap of activity that they can consider implementing to help facilitate that process. Likewise for risk functions, who also, struggle for many of the same reasons.
Well, Derek and Peter, thank you very much. Eleanor, I think it'd be lovely at some stage to return to that roadmap that Derek has just spoken about. And there's no better place in the world, I think, to talk about geopolitical risk than in Nur Sultan, the center of the biggest landmass in the world, the heart of Eurasia. So it's absolutely a perfect place to be talking about it. And Eleanor, I do hope we can come physically to Nur Sultan sometime in the coming months and certainly next year. We all hope for that. But may I, on my behalf, thank Derek and Peter for today, and Eleonora, thank you and your colleagues for inviting us to this wonderful event. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, George, Derek. That was lovely. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for sharing this expert judgment on geopolitical risk. And just once again, I would like to highlight that CSI, the Chartered Institute for Security and Investment, is one of the partners of University of the Future, And in cooperation with CSI, we're actively involved in professional development of local employees, local Palestinian specialists. So our session is over, and I thank you all again on behalf of BCPD, on behalf of AFC. Thank you all for participation. We're done.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks
everyone.
very much indeed.
Bye-bye. We'll speak soon.